seat and settle yourselves in. This is my first live event for nearly 2 years. So this wow, how amazing this is. People, humanoid life forms. It's really just excellent to see you. And we have people joining us at home this morning as well. So to those of you watching the live stream, you are very, very welcome. You've come to the right place, and stay with us for the hour because we're going to have a great discussion. So I'll introduce myself and, of course, our panelists in just a few moments. There is the inevitable housekeeping to get through before we get into the main discussion, and a little bit about the festival itself. So this is the Great Exhibition Road Festival, and this is the first day in effectively a whole week of events across the institutions of the Great Exhibition Road. So we're in one of them now, of course, the Royal Geographical Society. I'm from next door at Imperial College, which is participating, and of course, a load of the other museums and cultural organisations in this area as well. So the message to you here in the audience, and those of you watching at home, is when you've walked out and you've logged off after this morning, there's more where this came from, put it that way. There's more going on during the week. Talks, discussions, demonstrations, and fun stuff. So stay with us for all that. So what else can I tell you? We want this to be interactive. So we're going to have a discussion. Who knows, maybe a heated discussion. We'll see how this goes. I mean, it's certainly a very emotive topic, climate justice, and we want you to be part of that as well. And we hope some or a lot of what you're going to hear this morning is going to provoke you here in the audience, and those of you watching at home. I have an iPad here so I can take your comments at home as we go along as well. So in fact, please don't feel that you're at a disadvantage watching the live stream, because literally you're all right here on this iPad, so you've probably got greater access to the chair than even the people here in the room. So we do want you to interact. So we'll get the discussion going, and then as we go along, I will pause and just see if there are any questions from you. Maybe you'll just jump in and heckle. I haven't dealt with any heckles for so long. Let's see what happens. But no, do be kind. So that's really the opening sort of gambit in terms of the housekeeping here. There is some COVID housekeeping. Now, you will see that at the front here, we are not wearing face coverings. That is because we are sitting side by side. You can see we're reasonably distanced as well. And of course, most importantly, for your safety, we're distanced from you. So that's why we're not wearing our face coverings. But we have been backstage in the green room, and we're going to put them on again as soon as we leave. And that factors into what I was just going to say to you here in the audience. We would like you to keep your face coverings on during this discussion. So in the audience, it's a bit different. So we will ask you, and I know, I must admit, when I saw that in the briefing, I thought, oh, no, the audience have to keep them on. But then at the same time, we are in the middle of a pandemic here, 30,000 cases a day and 100 deaths. So we're not through it yet. And we've been wearing them for 18 months, so you can handle it for another hour. So I admire, and I'm really pleased to see you keeping those on. So as we go along, in the old days, pre-pandemic, we'd have brought a microphone to you so you could pose your questions. What we're going to ask you to do on this occasion is to come up to the microphone. There's one right here at the front, and you'll pose your question from there. So that's the COVID housekeeping. And of course, when we finish, we are unceremoniously going to have to get you to leave quite quickly. So you can't all hang around and chat with each other, not in here anyway, because we need to clear the room, let those aerosols kind of filter back down again, and we'll be having other panel discussions coming through every hour and a half here today. It's quite a busy space, so we will have to ask you to leave at the end of this. So look, that's all the preamble. I hope that all sounds okay. And so what we're going to do today is talk about climate justice. And really, it's wonderful, of course, that we're having all these discussions about mitigating climate change. We're in the lead up to COP26, and of course, the running theme throughout the Great Exhibition Road Festival is around the climate and sustainability. Incredibly important. But if you actually look at it, we often hear our world leaders talking about green economies, green jobs, green technology. But guess who those world leaders are that we hear that from? It's those from the developed West, isn't it? So really what they're talking is about mitigating climate change in a way that very conveniently shores up their business models and lines their pockets. So actually, these efforts to mitigate climate change, laudable though they might be, are widening inequalities. It's just prolonging. It's just this development, really, of corrosive, extractive capitalism, climate injustice. And, of course, we hear about all these amazing technologies like geoengineering, and, of course, solar farms and wind farms. But how many of those are ending up on the land of indigenous people? And how much of a say do they have in it? And we might argue, very little indeed. Climate injustice. But on the other hand, this is surely a historic moment where we reverse all that. You know, if ever there was a crisis, if ever there was a global issue, precision engineered to break down those power structures and those business models that have emerged since the Industrial Revolution, it would be this. It would be climate change. And by their very nature, renewables are locating the power generation within the communities that will benefit from that. And this quite rapid now retreat from oil is just reshaping the global economy in a way that promotes social justice, that promotes equality, climate justice. So I've set the groundwork there. Climate injustice or climate justice? And to be honest, I don't know. I'm only the host here. But we have a panel here who really will be able to answer these questions and address these questions for us. So we're going to say hello to them this morning, and we're delighted to have them. Sitting over here, on my left, on your right, is Georgia. This is Georgia White, who's a visiting lecturer within the RCA School of Architecture. She's part of the Climate Justice Research Group, and she looks at climate justice, especially in the context of indigenous communities. We also, but in fact, before we meet the others, I'm going to put you on the spot right away, Georgia. I did warn you. How would you define climate justice?
It's a very difficult question. I think that climate justice has a lot of faces, according to who you ask. And I think what's most important about it is bringing forward frameworks that allow a multiplicity to come forward. I don't think it's for us to speculate one version of justice. I think it is literally about frameworks that connect multiple points of view at different scales and allow for those most affected to demand their own version.
So it's not just one single thing, I suppose. Yeah,
I don't think so.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Georgia. So Christina Jarros is also here, a landscape architect, urban designer, also within the RCA's School of Architecture and the Climate Justice Research Group, and looks at the local impacts of large-scale geoengineering projects. I'm going to be very interested to hear from Christina as we go along about these large projects, and are these a good thing or a bad thing for the places where they're located, often in indigenous communities and on indigenous land. So Christina, you can see it coming, can't you? How would you describe climate justice?
Well, I agree with Georgia. It's not, I don't think there's one answer to that question for sure, or one version of justice. But I guess in broad terms, I think the conversation about climate justice is really about recognizing that the climate crisis that we're in is also one of justice. So it's really about completely reimagining what governance looks like and who is invited to the table and how different evidentiary systems can be opened up to allow for different people to speak about and to propose ideas for solutions rather than always being proposed to.
Okay, thank you. Courtney Bailey is also here on our panel. She completes our panel this morning. Climate Finance Research postgraduate in Imperial Centre for Environmental Policy, and is especially interested in climate justice in the context of economic investment and also the financing of climate change initiatives and the whole structure, I suppose, of the global economic system in terms of certainly kind of economic justice, we might say, Courtney, and social justice. So what about climate justice? How would you describe it?
Well, I agree with both Georgia and Christina. And I think one point Georgia said I really hold on to, which is it's about defining it in the way in which the people who are affected think about it. Now, from my perspective, I am from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. That's an island in the Eastern Caribbean. So it's a small island developing state. We're amongst the most vulnerable to climate change. And also from the perspective of somebody who's working in climate finance. So from that angle, when I think of climate justice, it's about providing the support to those who need it the most, and that's the developing countries, and financial and technical support so that they can adapt to climate change, but also transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient, sustainable development whereby we're not leaving the poor behind and widening those inequality gaps that was mentioned before.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And I realise actually I didn't indulge myself by telling you who I am, so I'm going to have a go now. So I'm Gareth. I'm Gareth Mitchell, and I'm also at Imperial College. I'm just next door. I'm one of the science communication tutors, but I'm also a radio host. So every week I host a technology radio programme on the BBC World Service, and for a long time I've been on the BBC, on the radio. So enough about me. So I'm going to start by asking the panel really where the compromises are here, you know, because in my deliberately provocative introduction, I sort of put it to you all really that we attempt to mitigate climate change, but does that bring compromises? And I'm sort of rather looking at you, Georgia, here first. In terms of, you know, let's assume that we all want to tackle climate change, but along the way, is it actually just propagating existing power structures, and ultimately it'll still be the rich who benefit and the poorer and the low and lower income countries who do not reap the benefits?
Okay, it's quite a huge
I know,
question.
it's a massive question. And feel free to break it down, Georgia. I know it's a big way to start.
Okay, are there compromises? I think, of course there are compromises. I think we have to consider, though, where the balance is of who is compromising. Certainly in a lot of places where we are extracting minerals that are needed for an energy transition that is considered green, are not areas that people will benefit from the transition. And so the compromise is very much out of balance. So whether that's propagating power structures, of course it is. A lot of the ways that we enact extraction is through colonial pathways that have set up these power structures. And I think when we talk about post-colonial development, I think we have to recognize that we're not in a post-colonial era yet. A lot of those issues overshadow what we're doing. And so in order to address who is making what compromises, I think we have to address that. So it means addressing things like land rights and the right to negotiate, which has been addressed in policies like ILO Convention 169, which allows the right of equal negotiation of those affected, regardless of property ownership, and UNDRIP, which is the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Those give us some frameworks to work with, but we need to address the ways in which these are carried through legal systems and evidentiary processes to allow different claims to come forward, and to recognize how these frameworks are biased against people that have different histories and relationships to land. I think we need to look at not only the scientific impact of these systems, but also some of the social relationships to ecosystems that are ignored.
Right, so, and this is one of your big research interests, isn't it, in terms of land rights, and you mentioned it there in your reply. So where does that come into play? Is it, in the sense that these are lands that could harbour the minerals needed for green technologies like solar? Is that part of it then? Or they could be the site of wind farms? Or how does that actually play out?
I don't think the issue is as much really the sites of things like wind farms, which are usually in the richer countries which are developing the energy. So we don't have the same disbalance of power in those countries on a historical sort of level. What we're talking about is for example, lithium, which is needed to create energy storage, which is needed for the batteries that allow us to take energy from solar and from wind, is often the largest sites of extraction for lithium are in the lithium triangle, which is Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, in Australia and in China. And in both Australia and in Latin America, you're looking at what is historically, obviously, First Nations territories that have not yet achieved full recognition in the eyes of colonial law. So you're building upon a history of dispossession with the kind of the massive financialization of the green agenda.
Right, okay. So very interesting about, that extractive element to the problem here as well. So, and Christina, what about you? Because you're quite interested in geoengineering. And I'd love to, just to help me out and the audience here, what do we mean when we say geoengineering?
Well, yeah, this is part of what I work on in a way. Geoengineering, in simple but broad terms, is just intervening within the planetary system to redirect, slow down, or stop climate change. There's kind of two tracks currently for this. One is carbon removal, which has been around carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere, which has really kind of been around longer. And although certain projects within this are controversial and have instigated certain policies at international levels to basically put it on halt, so it isn't something that's actively being done. It's not nearly as controversial as the solar radiation modification projects, which is the other side of that. And that's directly intervening within the atmospheric systems. And this is where my interests lie, because it's really about opening up new frontiers of extraction. And claims to weather in the way that we are dealing with like land rights issues. How do we deal with air rights issues when it comes to clouds, for example, as resources?
Yeah, I mean, two absolutely fascinating sort of insights there. I mean, it's partly that we're going from the ground where we've just been discussing the extractive element with Georgia, and then the sky. Who owns that? But even just the bombasticness of going up into the sky and engaging in cloud seeding, or whatever techniques there might be, presumably to put some kind of natural shield over the Earth to reflect solar energy back out again. It's as grandiose as that. Yes. Okay. It's kind of alarming, so I suppose if we're talking George's case about what we do about extracting minerals from certain lands and empowering, I suppose, re-enfranchising the rights of people to say what goes on in their land, that's one thing, but what goes on in the sky, that's policy-wise, economically, really problematic. But what about those who would say, yes, but these are brainy scientists and engineers who have made this work, it's one of our only hopes, we shouldn't dismiss it. And it's on a grand scale. This could really make a difference. It could be the magic bullet that helps everybody, indigenous communities, rich people alike.
Yeah, well, I'm not against developing these ideas. Yeah, sure,
but you're raising important questions.
But I think there are really critical questions that have to be answered before we go tinkering with the air.
Yeah.
And they're not being addressed, quite frankly. When we talk about basically turning the thermostat of the Earth down, that sounds great. Everybody thinks we all benefit from that equally. But if we're not involved in that process equally, so if the entire globe doesn't do it at the same time and in similar ways, then it is uneven and it creates more problems. And it's also something that once you start it, you can't stop. So although some of the technologies for these projects are rather affordable, there is still asymmetry in the way that the deployment of these ideas is discussed.
Okay. So we've gone from the earth to the sky, and you brought up there affordability, which brings me really conveniently onto you, Courtney, because you're an expert in the economics of all this, and you especially know about the small island developing nations, like those in the Eastern Caribbean, one of which you've recently returned from. So one question is kind of who pays for this, and do these already vulnerable economies just have to accept a further hit onto their GDP in order to pay for all this climate change mitigation?
Well, in terms of who pays, it depends on how you look at it. You can pay with what you already have, which is, for a lot of developing countries, they're paying with the impact on their economies, so in terms of loss and damage. And then who pays in terms of the mobilization of capital, or finance as another word to say. Both countries are paying. So we have the developed countries paying and we have developing countries paying. But I'll take the opportunity to just clarify what climate finance is, or is supposed to be, by firstly saying that there's no real definition on what climate finance is. And that is kind of what triggers that question of who pays. So climate finance was born out from the UNFCCC, United Nations Convention on Climate Change. And that was based on the understanding or identifying that developing countries had different capacities than developed countries to adapt, mitigate, and transition. So the convention decided, well, we'll have developed countries, both the public and private sector in developed countries, finance the transition, technology transfer, etc., in developing countries. But right now, capital is not being mobilized at the scale needed. So what developing countries need, we're not meeting those needs right now. So on a global landscape, developed countries promise that long-term goal of 100 billion, so to provide 100 billion per year by 2020. We're now in 2021. We haven't gotten to that goal. You probably would have heard on the news when the Prime Minister went to the US, there was a lot of discussion around that. So currently we're around an estimate of 78.9 billion being mobilized to developing countries, and that's not enough. So even for adaptation alone, it's more than that. So in terms of who's paying, the developing countries, so those countries who are most vulnerable, they're paying more because they're experiencing more impacts, but also in terms of how the finance is being delivered. We look at, there is a report from Climate Shadows from Oxfam in 2020, and they revealed that although climate finance to developing countries was increasing, this is being done through loans. And after repayment of those loans, those countries were actually only receiving about 45% of the finance. So it seems like developed countries are getting money, but it's not enough. So they're paying both ways in terms of repaying and loss and damage. So I guess that kind of says there's an injustice there, and we need to work on that.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a glaring injustice, because a lot of the discourse ahead of COP26 is going to be about bringing developing countries on board. And I see if you agree with this, but I would say, just as somebody who watches the news and follows these events as best he can, that it seems that we're often talking about the large developing economies, and people say, well, why can't India or China continue to develop, when the West has had a 100-year industrial revolution head start and has been the problem to begin with. So often it's about those larger or sort of middle-ranking countries. I hear very little in the news about small island developing nations, injustice.
Yeah. But there is the Alliance of Small Island States, and you probably won't hear about them a lot, but in negotiations, they champion for a lot of the small island developing states, the different regions, Pacific, Eastern Caribbean, etc. But yeah, I think a lot more focus needs to be paid to them. In the beginning of my research, I termed something as being slipping through the cracks. So we're kind of slipping through the cracks because we're smaller economies, but it's important that these smaller economies also get some focus and get some assistance.
Yeah, so, I mean, going off script here slightly, but I mean, I was just thinking, wouldn't it be great if there was some kind of global forum where all nations, whether large or small, had an equal voice around the negotiating table and had a say in what happens next in meeting climate goals? And like, oh, we're having one, aren't we? In a few weeks' time. It's called COP26. Well, just springing this one at you all, if you fancy taking it, how optimistic you feel about it. Will climate justice be done at COP26? You may or may not answer, because I didn't warn you about this question. I've just thought of it, it's how it goes. So starting with you, Courtney, you were talking there. Do you see this as an opportunity? And I'm being a little bit facetious for the sake of discussion, but seriously, this is an opportunity, isn't it, for these smaller nations to have their voice around the table? Will it be heard?
Well, I'll be optimistic. Yeah, I'm gonna say I'm being optimistic, hoping that we have the momentum needed to, on the climate finance front, meet and surpass that goal. But you never know. It's been 11 years since we set that goal, and we haven't really got there. But let's hope for the best. Let's hope that, I think, because of the pandemic and seeing the impacts that can have on our economies, that was a kind of a wake-up call for potentially how climate change can affect our economies, and that would kind of spur more action that we need. Yep.
Yeah, okay. So what about the two of you, Georgia and Christina? I don't know how closely you're following COP, but you must be, given what you do you see climate justice potentially being done at COP? So let's go Georgia and then Christina, and then the audience.
No.
No, okay.
We're way off meeting the conditions of the Paris Accord. And that I don't think was ambitious enough or radical enough. And I think there's a lot of posturing and a very, very heavy focus on technology and very little focus on expanding governance structures to consider that, even that many countries are left behind, but there's different types of people within those countries and different scenarios happening within those countries. And I don't think that's something that's being addressed.
Okay, how about you, Christina?
The last thing that Georgia said is exactly where I think we ultimately will always fall short, is that because we deal with these things on a global or international scale, and inevitably we don't really address the inequalities within countries, particularly large ones. Not everyone in the US experiences climate change or justice equally, or in India or Chile, there's no real mechanism right now that allows for people of specific risk levels or types, perhaps, to sort of come together and have their rights sort of exercised and their voice spoken.
Yeah, it is. It's still that's a disconnect between those who are the polluters and those who are the recipients of the problems relating to that pollution, and it's really hard to know how that problem might be fixed. And in my own experience as a BBC journalist, I'm afraid I've seen the build-up to and often the disappointment following a number of these COP conferences. I did a lot of reporting ahead of the COP in Copenhagen in 2009.
So that's what I was referring to.
That was the one, okay.
Yeah,
So, because Ed Miliband, I think, negotiated for the UK in that one. But anyway, I wasn't actually at that conference, but I was in Copenhagen in the run-up, and we went to all kinds of places to report on all these wonderful engineering schemes that might make a difference. And I remember the sort of disappointment following 2009. Paris seemed rather different, but I didn't report on that. But I've seen the few highs and many lows, I'm afraid, as a reporter. But what about you as an audience? And not so much, I'm not going to ask you all, do you think climate justice will be done? A simpler question in a way is just, are you or are you not optimistic about what's going to happen at COP26? And perhaps we've been a bit downbeat over it on the panel here, but don't let that sway you. There are plenty of people outside there who will tell you this is a remarkable opportunity. The US now seems to be on board in a way that we feared wouldn't have been the case maybe a few years ago. this must be a cause for optimism as well. So I don't mean to prejudice your answers too much, but just over to you. You've got your own minds. Hands up who thinks that COP26 will be a good opportunity. Don't all rush at once. So it's a good opportunity, okay. So the panel agrees it's a good opportunity. So let me rephrase that question. You may keep your hand up or then withdraw your vote. How about if we just say, hands up if you think there'll be good outcomes, overall, that there'll be good outcomes from COP26 in a few weeks' time. So a really resounding hand up there. So 2 or 3 hands up. So it's not a complete write-off. There's a kind of maybe, I think. There's an abstention, quite a few abstentions in the room. Good. Well, I appreciate the optimistic hands going up here. And I kind of feel that we need to keep there's some spirit of optimism going on. If it's not going out here in our communities, how do we expect it to be going on in those negotiating centres at COP26? All right, then, so hands up who's pessimistic about COP. Oh, lordy, nearly everyone. Right, okay. Well, it's been a lovely panel. Thanks for coming. And let's see if we can change things as we go along. And let's come back to you, Georgia, and thanks for your participating there, audience. And I've got the iPad on, so let me know what you think at home. Just are you optimistic about COP26 and why? About Indigenous communities, and I want to bring, because that's one of your big research areas. And I think, if I'm right, that you're interested in a kind of comparative study, would you say, between Chile and Australia? Just set this up for us, this research that you're doing. It's really interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, my research looks at land rights in general, and it looks at those that have fewer rights than others. But yeah, I'm part of a project that I can't take credit for, that it's comparing the situation of Chile and Australia, both of which are large extraction centres of lithium. And lithium is such an important part of the transition to sustainable energy. But of course, it has a dark side. It's about really who manages the extraction of lithium and how it is managed. It is often in Chile and Australia in Indigenous or First Nations territories, both of which have different levels of recognition according to who they were colonised by. So, of course, Australia has a legal system of British jurisprudence and was declared terra nullius when it was discovered, which means that it wasn't considered as conquered or taken from existing peoples. It was considered that those peoples did not exist because they had no social structures or legal structures that were recognised by the British colonisers. And that wasn't reversed until 1992 in a landmark decision, which was the Mabo case, which started to bring about Indigenous rights. In Chile, they have the French or mainland European sort of code-based model. So there's slightly less flexibility in how justice has evolved in the post-colonial sort of era. And they have very different histories of extraction as well. Chile has a massive history of extraction, and a lot of the laws that govern the use of resources like water are engineered in order to facilitate massive extraction that is centralized within the state and increasingly with international companies. So the treatment of land rights within those models is quite different and interesting to compare. And what we're looking at is the processes through which land rights, the granting of land rights, are kind of corrupted by the preference for extractivism within those two different legal systems. But it's also about the different forms of evidence when you consider not only that we're trying to protect the environment and we're protecting the rights of future generations for the world. We're also enacting these things in places where rights of future generations are considered differently. Time is not necessarily linear. Rights of future generations is also preserving the rights of your ancestors. And there's a completely different construct of territory and preservation. And that's something that comes into these cases. So it's not that I'm anti-extraction and then saying lithium just shouldn't be extracted. But it's really that some of these legal systems that we brought about through colonization directly exclude the voices of others and the way that they demonstrate historical ties, territory, ecosystemic health, spiritual and relationships of kinship. So I might have gone off piece slightly there.
No, I think you remain very much on piece, actually, because you're sticking to that central problem of lithium extraction and the legal difficulty around that. And you were saying, I'm not against this, but there's just a lot to consider.
Yeah, it's very much like other types of extraction, but lithium is very interesting because it is so key, really, to this transition.
Okay. Yeah. So I think one thing that is emerging from this panel as we grapple with this really difficult subject of climate justice is it's kind of less about the technology. We've spoken a bit about geoengineering and grandiose plans to do cloud seeding and what have you, but so much about structures, and we were hearing there about legal structures, the legacy of decolonization. And perhaps we could talk a bit about economic structures with Christina and Courtney. And we could factor in this question from Hannah Woodward at home, who actually asks, is it economically and structurally viable for developing countries to skip the traditional industrialization phase of development, often associated with fossil fuels, and then just go straight to green technology instead, to leapfrog, if I might use that term, into green technology? So I suppose the question there is do existing economic structures allow that to happen, or is some kind of extractive, fossil fuel kind of method, technology, inevitable? So I don't know, I'm definitely going to come to Courtney, but I just want to run that one by you, Christina, as well, just this. And you might want to comment about just even sort of economic structures, because you have this great interest in design, for instance. So is this like a design issue, but not so much in terms of aesthetic design, but maybe the design of economies?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, we'd have to sort of work with what we have right now in terms of how do we modify or redirect certain momentums within our existing economic systems towards different manifestations of fuel, of power. Are those adequate? Is it possible to get where we need to go? I don't know. But I think, that is part of the design project of climate justice.
Yeah, but do we just have to accept that fighting climate change might mean that developing nations have to kind of rein in their attempts in order to just grow their economy? Is that part of it?
Well, I think they have to share, right?
Yeah.
So I think a lot of things, when we talk about geoengineering, for example, I think the biggest fear within these projects has always been that these technologies will be used by people to protect their assets, the assets that they own, with little regard for those who do not.
Yeah.
And that is what we see, actually, in the experiments that are happening. So yes.
Okay, sure. And Courtney, what about you then, and on that sort of that economic structural question?
I'll take what I remember from the question first. I think it's not just jumping to that. We have to definitely transition, and that transition requires building those structures and putting those structures in place, changing the way in which the financial system looks at climate risks, for example. You have to change those, you have to put those structures in place to get countries, to get industries seeing the benefit to moving towards a low carbon, climate resilient pathway. So it won't be today for tomorrow, because our economies right now are fossil fuel dependent. So it's about changing our economies so that we start moving at a faster pace, hopefully, towards that low carbon, climate resilient development, where within our financial sectors, we're valuing climate resilience, which is investment in adaptation, et cetera. We're valuing investment in mitigation in low carbon technologies. We're putting the right policies in place and governance frameworks so that for different countries, different sectors, they can then say, okay, we need to change. We have to have the right laws so that deters people from extraction. Well, the ones that are high emitting. But yeah, I think it's not limiting, I think, because some research has shown that that pathway proves to be more beneficial in the long run. So yeah, that's my take.
Yeah.
Just to say, I think I completely agree with that, but in order to do any of this, we need less friction between local, regional, national, and international systems. So, we can change financial policies or economic incentives at a international level or a regional level, but if those things don't register on the ground in hyper-local situations, it never gets passed. So if you shut down a coal mine or something in one place, but then you don't give those specific people a new job and something better to do and a way to survive, you're back where you started.
Yeah, you're just creating. In fact, it's a point that Mike Wilkins makes at home. Kind of comment versus question. The social costs, such as unemployment from the transition to net zero, is often cited as a climate injustice. So entirely the point you were making there, Georgia.
I just pick up on this idea of this green transition, meaning that we move away from industrialization. Green tech is not non-industrial. I don't think, right? And I think that's part of this issue as well, is that we're simply trying to replace one thing with another without actually looking at the way that we govern this world and our own practices.
Yeah, exactly. And that was one of my provocations in the opening, that sort of green tech, we often hear it spouted from those who are already rich, from economies that have already done very nicely, thank you very much, over the last 100 years with their fossil fuel-based economies. And you just wonder, again, in terms of climate justice, how much that green tech revolution is going to make money and increase wealth for people who haven't enjoyed wealth perhaps quite as much.
Maybe instead of buying, having an electric car and buying a new one every 2 years, we shouldn't buy a new car every 2 years.
Yes,
maybe there should be some reconsideration of how we operate.
Yeah, sure. And Christina, what do you have sort of examples of sort of progressive ideas then in geoengineering maybe, or in green tech in general, if we take the conversation in that direction? What can we get excited about?
Not really.
No? Okay, I'm sorry.
I do think, I think that these green technologies and geoengineering, there is inherent progressive thought in the methods used and the way that different disciplines of science and other disciplines are sort of coming together to rethink or think through problems like that. But in order for there to be real difference or real progress in these things, we have to completely reimagine the governance structures that these things operate within. And I have not seen any movement in that realm.
Yeah.
So.
And Mike says Mike, it's about ensuring the industrial north contributes to the costs of climate resilience and adaptation in the developing south. That's Mike's view. What does the audience in the room here think? Does anybody want to bravely come up to the microphone of power? And yes, come on over. And we need you to come to the mic, otherwise people at home won't hear you. Yeah, it's just over here, just right at the front by the...
Is it at one point more upright?
Yes, it's not very upright. You may have to do some,
have to kneel at it.
That's it. It's quite adjustable. Yes.
Hello. Thank you all so much. My reason for being so optimistic is because I think that we have all the technology and the solutions that we need to basically solve this problem in terms of knowledge and technology. We have it all. We just don't have the joined up thinking or the will, or I think the confidence in the solutions, and I don't think there's enough joined up thinking. And I totally agree with what you said, Christina. Like there isn't the understanding within our local authorities, our regional authorities, or in our central authorities on how we can mobilize these solutions and how we can get together and how people can come together. And it's that I think is really stifling progress. And I think it's really difficult because on one hand, I'm like, the COP, this is amazing. We've got all these opportunities, people coming together. This is like the SDG number 17, like partnerships for the goals. This is great. But on the other hand, you have people in power who aren't experts where we need experts to be. I think it's ridiculous that in places of of power within central governments. You don't have experts running that particular thing, and that's what I think is stifling progress. Like, my job that I do in my at work is I work for a company called Namine Solar, and we're basically trying to eradicate kerosene lamps and exactly do this, like leapfrog, help developing countries, especially Africa, move past fossil fuels and go to solar, because we have it. It's all there. It's kind of, sorry, that's more of a monologue than anything else, but it's I just wanted to share, and just thank you all so much for all your info. Thank you.
We appreciate it. Well, thanks for that question that also turned into a comment. And we have but I'm glad you mentioned kerosene lamps, because there surely, and we'll take these other questions as well, is climate justice, because kerosene lamps excite me, because, well, they cut a lot of pollution, and they improve the air that is breathed in these homes of people in low-income countries. But then that leads to having the lights on all later into the evening, so that the kids can have better education. So that improves education, which also then relieves the burden on parents, so they can work further, and then you get the economic development. So from kerosene lamps that might seem like an, in inverted commas, simple innovation. It's not a grandiose plan like cloud seeding, but from that innovation in enough homes, real hope emerges, and climate justice. It sounds like you're... Oh, look, we've got a demo. Look at this. I don't know if... Thank you. Cheers, Iz. Thank you. All right, let's switch on for this. So I just switch it on here, isn't it? No, of course, it's really, really bright. Okay, there you go. So, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of these going into homes in, across sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, and other regions, and the kids can do their homework, the parents can cook, and they're not being choked to death by kerosene lamps. Happy days. Thank you. That's a really amazing example. Round of applause for that, I think. Look at that. Kerosene lamps. Thank you. All right, yeah, I won't shine it in my eyes. I hope the people at home saw it on the webcam as well. I'm sure they did. Thank you. Right, we're on fire here. Not a kerosene fire. We're on a solar sustainable fire here. So this gentleman here, and we'll get through as many as we can. So these will have to be brief questions now, I'm afraid.
I'll make it brief.
But yeah, go for it. Yeah, and if you want to, say what your name is.
It's John Atkins. I'm an engineer by profession, working in the sugar industry around the world. Is there a disconnect between the problem of climate justice, which is rooted, I think, in, or the solutions are coming out of government, and climate injustice, which very often is focused in the private sector, particularly transnational companies, who have the ability to influence the developing and developed governments to get what they want without any controls. And therefore, how does the panel see solutions to climate justice coming without some form of greater state control over the private sector and the shareholders and the financiers? And in a way, this question leads to Courtney, and where financiers are financing private sector projects, and how much drive is there to ensure that they don't finance projects that lead to climate injustice?
That's a really interesting question, and we'll say, Courtney, hold that thought. Let's just take a few in a row, and we'll get through as many as we can from the panel. We'll see which ones they want to take. So yes, I can see you with your hand up over there, and then we'll come to you at the back. Brilliant. Real people asking real questions. Good stuff. Yeah, if you line up, soon to ask your question.
Hi there, Alex. I just wanted to bring up that we've sort of spoke about how we could bring developing countries sort of leap forward to a green future and things. And my comment/question is that I'm not sure we fully appreciate, or rather, there is a third negative, if you will, Courtney, that I don't think we fully measure how the developed countries have a further negative effect, because they sort of use resources from the developing countries by exports and all of that, and how that gets quantified and how it doesn't sort of impact even more, like how the developing countries not pay that as well.
Yeah, sure, I get it. Yeah, thanks, Alex. And then my friend here is just going to come up to the mic as well.
My name's Pete. I'm an air quality scientist, but that's nothing to do with my question. I've got a question about having indigenous people in governments. How effective is that? And is it a good step forward in, for example, in Brazil? Would this avoid corruption and would it lead to fairer decisions?
Great, 3 really good questions. And then I know there's another one at the back. We'll see if we have time. Thank you for that one. Let's take them kind of in reverse order in that case, and these might have to be reasonably brief answers. And that last one seemed to be addressed to you, Georgia, I think, about the role of, or maybe the lack of a role, of indigenous communities or representatives of those communities in legislatures like those in Brazil.
I think the short answer is that yes, I think of course it can help, and I think that's really also a very important part of the rewriting of the constitution that's happening in Chile at the moment. There was a portion of the committee was given to indigenous seats, and it's led by a Mapuche woman. I think it's a huge move forward that's really important, but I think there's also something to address in terms of governance and law and how processes are enacted. And it remains to be seen if that will translate to those different systems. So for example, in Australia, I think there's only one indigenous silk. And at the moment, the systems of land recognition are brought. It means bringing people off country into the cities where they're interrogated in front of a judge who doesn't understand their language or their practices, forced to give testimony and make maps of places that are sacred and secret. And so I think that until we bring those governance structures through to new practices of law and consultation, we won't fully see the benefits. But I do think it's a huge leap forward, and it's really important.
Okay, and I hope that answers our friend's question. Yeah, thumbs up there as well, thank you. And then we had that other question from Alex, and Alex, forgive me if I rephrase it incorrectly, we'll see how we go with this, but it seemed to be something like the developing countries, almost like plundering the resources, developed countries, higher income countries, plundering the resources from lower income countries in order to suit their climate change mitigation agendas. And there was kind of, I think, the sense of Alex's question. It's a very open one to whoever wants to take it on the panel. And then we'll come to that economics one, definitely for you, Courtney, towards the end. So, panel, what do we think on that question about that risk, I suppose, that Alex cited?
Well, going based on how you've rephrased it in the sense of using developing countries to kind of, meet their goals in that sense. One thing comes to mind, which is the clean development mechanism. So that was a mechanism whereby developed countries could invest in mitigating activities in developing countries. So that was like a carbon credit transfer in a sense. So it was a way of developed countries investing in low carbon technologies in developing countries. For example, a lot of that was the REDD+, but then that finance was used to then finance adaptation, put into the adaptation fund. So developing countries were kind of able to offset. But my take with that, it's kind of like what Christina kind of talked about when she said turning on the thermostat. It's just kind of shifting things around and not really addressing the problem. And although that is good in terms of having that mechanism whereby the finance goes towards adaptation, at the end of the day, what we do need is for developed countries to take up their responsibility and take ambitious targets and put the action in and invest in clean technologies, invest in resilience, not just in their own countries, but in developing countries who are experiencing the challenges, the damages that they've pretty much caused.
Yeah, because otherwise you end up, maybe quite significantly decarbonising the atmosphere in many ways, but at the cost of enormous climate injustice if we're not careful. What about John's point about the private sector? And if I can kind of paraphrase it, John, forgive me if this isn't quite how you wanted to ask the question, but maybe the risk possibly that governments and states kind of jump in and perhaps an overly interventionist way in sort of climate change mitigation, green technologies and so on. Sorry, John, if I've mangled your question. You asked it better than me, but Courtney remembers you asking it, I'm sure. So take up John's question.
I'll try to remember. I think he asked about perhaps how do you get the private sector to invest in low carbon, climate resilient development? That is what he said. So I think, well, I will jump to, I think I'm being biased in a way in terms of my background and going solely finance. Of course, you need the policies in place for that to happen. But one thing I think is transformational that has been going on for a number of years is sustainable finance and using and linking policy to sustainable finance and using the emerging financial instruments from that. So for example, we have green bonds. We have sustainability-linked bonds and loans where the private sector can link their initiatives to certain sustainability criteria, etc. And with green bonds, you link that to green initiatives, and there are principles for that. So I think that's one way in which we can get the private sector on board. And also if we try to shift our economies to like a sustainable finance economy, then you have those benchmarks to say, okay, well, if we're not doing this, if it's undermining these things, then we shouldn't be investing in it. So that's, I guess, more of a simple answer, idealistic answer. If that's what's going to get us there, I don't know if that's,
Okay. Well, simple and idealistic is good when we've only got 4 minutes left, but it does seem like Georgia wants us to come in as well. So.
I just thought
just briefly.
A very good question. Sorry, very, very briefly. I thought it was a good question, the kind of the injustice and the justice and the balance of the state. I mean, interestingly, in the Atacama Desert in Chile, the main mining company is Esquema. It's a national mining company, and Albemarle, which is a US-based company. Albemarle made quite a historical move in granting 18 indigenous communities with 3% of earnings, not profit earnings, which was a massive amount of money that is unprecedented in terms of any kind of compensation given by the state. The state has been forced to follow suit, actually, but have put huge restrictions on how people should be able to use that money. And so I think there's a balance here in terms of how public pressure can actually influence international companies even where there aren't national frameworks. So, for example, Albemarle is not in any way pressured by the state to provide that compensation. And a lot of its practices are guided by international standards and pressure. Of course, there's also the flip side, which is this greenwashing, where we talk only about what is green and technologically and not what is just. And I think the confusion between justice and green is really important to address. So I do think regulation is really, really needed locally and internationally, and there needs to be some flexible bonds between those two scales. But I don't think it's only a matter of state versus international in that respect.
Okay.
There's really similar examples in Southeast Asia as well.
Okay, yeah, because I know you know a lot about Indonesia, for instance, Christina. So, okay, so just in the last minute or so, I'm really glad to see that in the audience today we have quite a few young people, actually. I'm looking at a few young people here. So the final question for you on the panel is your message to young people sitting in here, maybe thinking about what's going to happen in the rest of their lives, what part they can play in achieving climate justice, maybe in a way that the older generation like my lot haven't done so well. So, should they come to the RCA's Excellent School of Architecture and learn about it from you? That would be a perfectly good answer. Or be part of installing kerosene lamps and helping communities, empowering communities across Africa to put in, to get rid of kerosene lamps and replace them with solar. Just in a few words, what can and should young people do to improve climate justice? Who wants to go first?
I think that the younger generations, which I hope I'm still vaguely a part of.
You are, very much so, yeah.
Are doing already some amazing work in shifting conversations around justice. So, I mean, that's already in my lifetime, like a quite radical change in how we're looking at climate and how we're looking at designing better systems for the environment and for social dynamics moving forward. So.
Okay, excellent. So what about you, Courtney and Georgia? Should they be pressurising governments or becoming politicians or engineers or designers? Who wants to go first and last with?
I don't mind.
Okay, Georgia and then Courtney.
If you did come to the RCA, you should absolutely join a massive movement to get them to put in some decent environmental policies. Yeah, I think it is about trying to put pressure on governments. I think that it's something that simply isn't in the kind of selection of things to vote for until people start standing up and demanding it. And I think that is starting to happen, and it's really promising.
Brilliant. Courtney.
And I'll just wrap up by merging 2 points that were said. The young people, who I am also part of, I think we all are, they're doing amazing things, and policy is important. So even if you go into finance, if you go into design, if you are a scientist, the important thing is translating your work and trying to get that into policy so that that can make the change, because that's where we see the biggest change happening. So.
Okay. Well, young people, you are our future and our hope. So I hope you've taken note there as well. Just before we leave it, we'd love to get your feedback, by the way. So there's a URL on the screen. So do go over there. Let us know what you liked, what you didn't like. Great discussion. Shame about the host. Anything like that. Also, I think you've got that QR code. Gosh, we are living in the future. So you can use the QR code. At home, there's a survey link, and it's shortly appearing in the chat. And if you participate at home, you get the chance to win a £50 voucher. I think even in the room as well, or I'll buy you a drink or something like that. I'm really sorry if we missed your question. I think we got through them all, I hope so. And there's going to be a recording available, so if you loved it so much you want to relive it and watch the box set, then you can. It's going to be available via our website. So it's greatexhibitionroadfestival.co.uk. It's the longest URL in the world, but it's also really easy to remember, so no worries at all on that. And just keep in touch with us during the week. Go onto that website and just check out other events that are going along. Do come and support us. It's an amazing load of people who've put this together, and we need you to be there. So don't just come to this and call it a day. We really want you to participate during the week. So I'm Gareth Mitchell, but enough from me. Most of all, thank you to an amazing panel here. We've covered so much ground with them, and I love them very much. So that's Courtney, Georgia, and Christina. And also give yourselves a massive round of applause, dear audience, for being here in the room. And you at home, thanks for being here.